of liberty. The National Broadcasting Company presents another in a special series of programs under the auspices of the Council for Democracy. There was free talk in the old New England Town Hall and around the Cracker Barrel in the Crossroads store. And there is free talk by free men every week at this time, led by our host, Rex Stout. You may already know Rex Stout as the author of baffling detective mysteries, which can only be solved by that master of criminology, Nero Wolfe. On this program, you will get to know him even better as an outspoken champion of our American democracy. Mr. Stout.
Thank you, Jack McCarthy. Good evening, friends of liberty. We Americans are, quite properly, fondly proud of our freedoms and our democratic dignities, so much so that some of us are inclined to forget that we're by no means the only chickens on democracy's roost. We're the biggest and richest and most powerful democracy in the world, but we hold no monopoly of a love of liberty and an unconquerable will to keep it and expand it. Our guest today is a former member of the American Diplomatic Corps who is eminently qualified to remind us that other people, too, have learned that freedom is sweet and worth fighting for. Before the Honorable Florence Jaffray Harriman was appointed United States Minister to Norway in 1937, she had served on scores of boards and commissions, had helped to elect Woodrow Wilson president, had been a member of the Committee on Women in Industry in the World War, and had spent at least half her waking hours in welfare work for women and children. Her book of memoirs, Mission to the North, has just been published. Some of you listening might like to read that book to get a tip on how a woman goes about it to acquire the impressive title of Envoy Extraordinary and Minister Plenipotentiary. Or better still, Mrs. Harriman, won't you tell us now, how did you manage it?
I didn't manage it at all, Mr. Stout. It took me completely by surprise. One night the telephone rang at 1:30 in the morning, and a newspaper reporter wanted to know what I had to say on being appointed Minister to Norway. It was interesting but surprising. I had more or less made up my mind that the time had come for me to retire, but my daughter pointed out to me that here, even at my age, was a chance for a new adventure and a real experience. But to me, it was more than that. I welcomed another opportunity to serve my country. I realized the wide horizon of beauty and novelty that had opened before me. This was emphasized when I heard Flagstad sing.
When was that, after you got to Norway?
Yes. It was in the Frogner Park in Oslo on the night of July 5th, 1937. She sang Brunhilde's battle cry from De Valkyrie, and as I listened, I had a foretaste of all that I would find in Norway. Very suddenly, I saw a land steeped in mysticism, things felt but not seen. The ancient folklore lingering in the country places, in the dark pine forests, in the valley farms, and in the fisher villages that hug the shores of deep and narrow fjords. And above all, and also very suddenly, I felt all around me the sense of community, of common striving for great common goals, the sympathetic oneness of the people that marks the Norwegian democracy.
You say marks the Norwegian democracy. Does the Norwegian democracy have a special tone or flavor of its own as compared to ours? Is it better or more efficient or broader or narrower, or just different as nations are different, or what?
That's a very hard question to answer, Mr. Stout. Of course, it is different. It could hardly help being that when you compare the size of the countries. As to whether or not it's more efficient or broader, that's very difficult to say. Perhaps I could give you an answer by quoting what was said to me in Washington just after I was appointed. With smiling envy, a friend remarked, "Those Scandinavian countries are 25 years ahead of us all."
Did you find that to be true?
Well, to that I can answer definitely yes. Before the invasion, I quoted this remark to a gentleman of Oslo, and he replied, laughing, "You mean 100 years." But seriously, in a good many matters, my friend was right, particularly in the fields of social and political democracy. I honestly think that the small countries of the North, being less concerned with power politics and great industrial expansions, have made patterns for us all.
Don't you think their job was made easier by the fact that their people were pretty much all of one kind? That their background and their training rather inclined them to think and feel and react in much the same way?
Certainly. And then plain geography has a good deal to do with it. The general compactness of the small countries produces a sort of common knowledge and common awareness of common problems. Take the cooperatives, for instance. The milk cooperatives are a good example of what they mean in human terms. Before the pools were created, there was just chaos in the Norwegian milk market. The price of milk had dropped year by year. The same cows and the same farms, but lower and lower prices. Butter went down, cheese went down. Families faced actual want.
And what happened to change the picture?
They began to realize how each separate farmer, dealing alone with private merchants, was cutting his neighbor's throat. They began to organize and to pool all their knowledge, not only of the market, but of the control and betterment of herds. One farm mother put it into words when she looked at her children and said, "We had grown poor apart. We have grown prosperous and happy together."
What did the townspeople think of it? Didn't that toss monkey wrenches into their machinery?
Mr. Stout, that's where the homogeneity comes in, that we mentioned before. The farmers began to talk as if their work were not just a business, but as if they and the people of the towns were all a part of a really integrated pattern of living. They expect the townspeople to care about the welfare of the farmers and their children. And the wonderful part of it is that the townspeople do care, or did before the invasion. Not that they care less now, but of course the German occupation has put a stop to all the inspiring work of the years before 1940. When I first arrived in Norway, one of the things that made the whole country so sparkling and vigorous and enthusiastic was the sense of participation. Every citizen, townsman or farmer felt that he himself was taking part in the great work of making Norway a happier place to live in.
Well, that sounds as if they really were ahead of us, at least 25 years. How does the cost of all that work out in Norway, Mrs. Harriman, in cold cash?
It comes high, Mr. Stout, as good things always do. Some few citizens pay out as much as 80% of their incomes in taxes. But again, and whether or not you believe me, they seem happy to do it. Elsewhere in the world, I had taken poverty and slums as part of the enduring phenomena of city life. Not so in Norway. I understood what many Norwegians have told me they felt when they visited the great capitals of the world. Such shock at the misery complacently exposed that they were always glad to leave for home. Comments such as these came not from one class in Norway, but from everyone. For as a nation, the Norwegians have a social conscience. Politics in Norway is primarily the contest of parties for the task of raising the standard of living.
That sounds more like an ideal and aspiration than an actual achievement. From what you say, Mrs. Harriman, although we've done a lot here in America with a much greater problem, we still have a long way to go before we arrive at any such green pasture as that.
I think we're catching up, Mr. Stout. Of course, they have unemployment insurance in Norway, and sickness and old age benefits, and collective bargaining in industry. And then there's a really conscious and purposeful drive behind the organization and development of native arts and crafts.
Well,
that's the sort of thing I like to think of when I look back on my years in Norway, and not the terrible and tragic happenings of 1940.
Yes, I was coming to that, Mrs. Harriman. I know you don't like to think of those things, but for our own sake, for the sake of our American democracy here at home, I do want to ask you one or two questions. The first, if democracy was really such a living thing in Norway, how did it happen that they gave up so easily when the Nazis came? Was it the Trojan horses and fifth columns?
People speak of Trojan horses and fifth columns, yes. There has been a great deal written about how the easy occupation of Oslo was due to treachery. What we have to call the fifth column had indeed been busy. The Nazis were indefatigable in an infinite variety of ways, from defamation of the British to 1,000 minor tricks and stratagems of propaganda. There was trade acceleration. There was interchange of tourists and students. But not a bit of real evidence has been adduced, aside from Major Quisling and his small group, who moved swiftly to obtain possession of telephones, telegraph, and radio, that the Norwegian people, for a single moment, welcomed the invasion. Everything in the Norwegian democracy was opposed to Nazi brutality. The real reason for the lack of resistance at the beginning, when it might have counted most, was that the people of Norway simply couldn't believe what was happening. I know that sounds naive, but it's quite true. They were stunned, dumbfounded.
That naivete was fairly universal. In just the same way, there were thousands of people in this country who obstinately refused to believe that every Nazi tourist agency and consulate was in reality a headquarters for spreading subversive propaganda. It wasn't until President Roosevelt closed them down that many Americans finally woke up. But go on to Norway, Mrs. Harriman.
You have to remember, Mr. Stout, that for 100 years Norway had been at peace. In all that time, they had clung to the belief that decency, friendliness, honesty, and absolute fairness in their dealings with other nations would guarantee their neutrality. Even on the last morning, when German troop ships were known to be sailing into the fjords, Norwegians refused to realize that they were about to be invaded. When they woke up, it was too late. There was heroism then, and plenty of it. There were the bus drivers who deliberately drove their buses over the edge of a cliff for the German storm troops they had been made to carry. There was the retired naval officer who, in the dead of night, rowed alone in an open boat to rouse the garrison at Fort Oskarborg in time to sink the leading German battle cruiser as she came up the fjord. But it was not enough.
And you wouldn't say that Norway was taken by fifth columns and Trojan horses.
It was beaten down by brutal, overpowering force, Mr. Stout. It was beaten down by tanks and planes and guns, but principally by planes. But it's not dead. Democracy in Norway is not dead, and that is what I want to say here today, so that all Americans may know it and remember it. The invader, with his theory of master races and brute force, for the moment controls railways and ports, airfields and telegraph offices and newspapers. But he deals with a nation so strong in its inner life, so rich in all experience but the experience of military force, that it cannot be bought or beaten forever. There is this about democracy, Mr. Stout. Its leaders are everywhere, and its slogans call to the hearts of the humble. There are only 3 million people in Norway, but each one of them counts. Right now, today, there is a flame of revolt burning in Norwegian hearts. There are brave and open acts of rebellion against the foreign tyrant, and heroic sabotage which is practiced by all types and classes of Norwegians according to their various abilities. There are in Norway today 10,000 agents of the Gestapo, 1 to every 250 Norwegians, and 250,000 soldiers, 1 to every 10 Norwegians, fighting to stem the constantly rising tide of resistance. The people of Norway, Mr. Stout, will never surrender.
God bless them. And in that determination, I do not believe they are 25 years ahead of us Americans. One more question. You went into Russia while you were in Norway, didn't you, Mrs. Harriman? How do you think the Russian people will react to the Nazi declaration of war?
Well, I shouldn't like to venture an opinion on that. I was only a tourist. One gets many impressions, but not enough real information on a short visit. They take great pride in their achievements, and what they have done in a material way is amazing. The question is whether the material gains are worth the human sacrifice, the rigid political controls imposed on the people. I was told again and again by Russians, both high and low, that they wanted to be left alone to work out their own problems. I suppose that was the basic reason for the pact with the Nazis in 1939. It was really a negotiated peace. Stalin tried to appease, strike a bargain for peace, and that method just doesn't work when you are dealing with Mr. Hitler.
Thank you, Mrs. Harriman. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest this afternoon is Mrs. J. Borden Harriman, formerly United States Minister to Norway. This is Rex Stout saying goodbye until next week.
Next week, Rex Stout will bring Mademoiselle Eve Curie to the microphone. A copy of the script of this broadcast will be mailed free to anyone requesting it. Address, your letter or postcard to the Council for Democracy, 285 Madison Avenue, New York City. Speaking of Liberty has been presented as a public service by the National Broadcasting Company and the independent radio stations associated with the Red Network of the National Broadcasting Company, RCA Building, Radio City, New York.